Okay, we are back to the second of the Expanding Colonies lecture. And this one I'm going to try, I've got a couple of things to show you first. The first thing I want to show you in this examination of colonial development, really from the middle of the 1600s. So this is going to be after the establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the establishment of Plymouth Rock, the establishment of the early colonies of Maryland and Virginia. So this is really kind of the second spurt, emphasis, whatever, of colonial expansion. So we're going to look a little bit, again, at kind of the way England influenced that, but then we're also going to look at some of the other details that are going on. I want to start by showing you, we've got those pesky little Stuarts again. And so I'm going to run through kind of a quick breakdown, and then I've got a really funny video to show you. And I think it will show up using this, using screencast. So you've got Charles I, and we talked about him in the previous lecture, right? He was the one that replaced James, who replaced Elizabeth. Charles was the one who was far more Catholic and really kind of alienated everyone. But even beyond the religious issue, one of the big problems was that he was an advocate for the divine right to rule and divine monarchy. And that really put him in conflict. And we've kind of talked about how in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, part of what attracted, or part of what pushed them to creating Massachusetts is the fact, the level of frustration they had with the Stuart monarchy and the way politics were developing. And so you really have kind of this stalemate system. This is, very British, very world history, so we're not going to go into all the gory details. But you do need to know that he gets executed. Charles II, then his son, has to leave while Cromwell is the Lord Protector. And you have approximately 10 years while Cromwell is basically in charge of England. Now Cromwell will die. He'll try to have his son inherit the role of Lord Protector, which is kind of amusing since he was supposed to be like against kings and all that kind of stuff. But very clearly that was not how it was happening. And then when when they finally kick Cromwell's son out, what you'll see is you have this restoration period. And so the restoration is putting the monarchy back in place, the Stuarts back on the throne, and it's that whole process. And then later, Charles II will be replaced by his son James II, who again kind of alienates Parliament and is very Catholic and doesn't get along with anybody. And he will actually be overthrown by his sister, who is married to William of Orange, who is from kind of like the Dutch area, kind of Dutch Germanic Protestant region. And you will essentially have a peaceful revolution in 1688, where essentially Parliament invites William and Mary to come take the throne of England, and James II says, I don't want to be someplace where everybody hates me, so I'm going to leave and go hang out in France or wherever. And so he leaves the throne. William and Mary take over. When William and Mary take over, they kind of sign an agreement with Parliament that gives Parliament a little more say in the way government functions and, all that kind of stuff. So this is kind of the gist of it. So you should be getting the grasp that we've got a lot of changes going on. So I have a fun video to show you that I think you will enjoy. If I can get it to pull up. So I will try to be quiet and give you a chance to listen to this.
Stuarts. After the English Civil War, Oliver Cromwell ruled England, and he disapproved of just about anything fun.
Okay.
Merry Christmas, old maid.
Oh, relatives. How did you get past the guards?
Well, we just thought we'd pop by to wish you a very, Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas!
I'm a Puritan. I don't celebrate Christmas. In fact, I've had it banned.
Well, you won't say no to a spot of Christmas dinner, will you? Bought you a goose.
Guards!
What are you doing?
Christmas dinner is bad. It's sinful. I've ordered the army to confiscate all roast geese. Guards!
Whoa, 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 whoa. We'll lose the goose. We'll lose the goose. Fine. Why don't we all go down the pub or something?
Guards! understand. These frivolous events distract us Puritans from our devotion to Christ.
Well, we have to do something. I mean, Lucy's all made up.
With me?
Yes.
Gods! Oh, come on! Make up is sinful! Especially that I should have left home.
What?
Nothing.
Wait a minute. I got it. Why don't we all go to church? I mean, church isn't sinful, is it?
No, of course not.
Well, then let's all go to church.
God! Seize them! It's against the law to go to church on Christmas Day. Take these sinners to prison.
What? Wait. Oh,
Wait.
Yes.
Now lock them up and throw away the key.
Oliver Cromwell really did ban pretty much anything that was fun. Even Christmas! Yeah! Though secretly, he still liked music and smoking. So Christmas was sinful, but smoking was okay. What a weirdo! No wonder everyone wanted a king back on the throne.
My name is Charles II. I love the people and the people love me so much that they restored the English monarchy. I'm part Scottish, French, Italian, a little bit Dane, but 100% party animal. Champagne! Spaniels I adored, named after me too. Like me, they were fun with a natty hairdo. It's today my birthday, I can't recall. Let's have a party anyway because I love 'em all. Oh, hail the King of Bling. Let's sing, bells ring, ding, ding, ding. I'm the king who brought back partying. King Charles, my daddy, lost his throne and kings were banned. They chopped off his head, then on the Cromwell ruled the land. Old Ollie wasn't jolly, he was glum and he was proud. Would be miserable as sin, only sin he's not allowed. When Ollie died, the people said, Charlie me hearty, get rid of his old laws, come back with rather purty. This action's what they called the monarchy restoration, which naturally was followed by a huge celebration. The King of England says, to sing, okay. All say I'm the king who brought back partying. Great London fire was a whopper. In my reign, London city came a cropper. So this king did what was right and proper. All the fire proved more than a whopper. I'm a fire stopper. Married Catherine Brackensall, she was a love so true. There would never be another, well, maybe one or two. Lucy Walton, Nell Gwynn, Moll Davis, Bob Ravilius. Think that's bad, but her name's not as silly as As king, I must admit I broke the wedding rule. But who cares when I brought back the crown jewels? I reinstated Christmas, make up sport and even plays. I was the merry monarch, they were good old days. When said and done, King Charles, that's me, did run England for fun. I was the king, loved by everyone, my song is done. Party and all? Awful Egyptians.
Okay, so, cancel. We don't want to watch any more of that. Anyway, so that is Horrible History's Charles II, King of Bling rap song. So if the cutting out got on your nerves, that you can see how to Google it on YouTube if you're interested. But I thought that was a really amusing, and I've shown it several times in the past because it does a really good job of kind of depicting this difference between, say, Puritan rule of England and kind of the Stuart monarchy. So all of these things become push factors in the development of the colonial region. The Stuarts, the Civil War, the creation of the Commonwealth. Basically, you don't really have anyone who is solidly in control of England. And so there's really kind of this disconnect in what they're trying to do with the colony. So the other aspect of this whole process that I think is worth bringing out is this concept of Navigation Acts. And I do have another kind of link to show you. And this is actually a transcript from a textbook from 1904. So we're not going to obviously read the whole book, but there is a little section in here on the Navigation Acts that I think is really kind of worthwhile. And first off, let me point out, this is from 1904. So what I'm saying about the Navigation Acts is not new historical interpretation. This is pretty old school. And this website kind of takes you through what the Navigation Acts were, The essence of it is kind of this process by which they try to control the flow of goods. Remember, we've got the issue of mercantilism and the idea that the country with the most favorable trade balance, the country that is doing the best as far as providing its own raw materials, making manufactured products, having enough markets for its manufactured products, that doesn't have to depend on any other countries, is the strongest country. And if you had a glance through some, you can sort of see that that you have Cromwell and that kind of stuff beginning this. They begin to have enumerated articles, which are specific articles that can only go to England. They can't go to any other countries. And it kind of breaks it into these different types of systems. So if you're interested in this, I mean, we could read the Navigation Acts and go into a whole historical analysis of those. Notice that you've got the Board of Trade and Plantations and some of these other things. The big key that I want you to kind of pay attention to is this last little section right here, where essentially it's saying that one perspective of the Navigation Acts is that it was unfair to the colonies, and I suppose on one level it was, but even this older textbook points out the idea that in reality, England was not treating the American colonies any different than any other country treated its colonies. I mean, this was standard procedure. And so it really was not that awful. In addition, England and the English colonies were full of smugglers. Smuggling was a very common and maybe not accepted, but at least largely, kind of nodded at sort of profession. You had a lot of smuggling going on, both from people in England and among the colonists, and they were able to smuggle pretty freely. And this all goes back to the fact that the Navigation Acts were hard to enforce. Well, part of why they were hard to enforce is because of this whole thing that I just described to you with Cromwell and the Stuarts and then the Restoration, and we got all this confusion. And so they passed these laws trying to control the flow of trade, and by and large, and it says here that England managed to be fairly successful at controlling the flow of trade. But we do know that there was, there was a lot of, there was very little enforcement, not a lot of enforcement, little enforcement of these Navigation Acts. And it's kind of part of this process of England gradually losing touch with its colonies. I mean, one could argue that that really began from the minute the House of Burgesses was created. I mean, I don't know. But the Navigation Acts do indicate that England was attempting to control the economic resources of its colonies and possibly not doing so in a very effective way. And so you need to kind of grasp that that was happening, because when we start talking about independence, and what made the American colonies so frustrated, I mean, we're going to ask the question, what did they really have to be frustrated about? And that, don't get me wrong, there were some things to be upset over. But you need to grasp that this idea of Navigation Acts and enumerated articles, and the idea that England somehow controlled trade and influenced the way the colonies traded with other places, that's nothing new. That's pretty much been in place from, 1640s. And the colonies didn't do anything about it back then. Obviously, you're talking about, them being able to smuggle. But still, this is just kind of part of that historical context of our founding fathers that we need to understand. So the Navigation Acts and the enumerated articles reinforce royal power and mercantilism, all to strengthen the English economy. We still have major exports from the American colonies, primarily tobacco, but after that you've got sugar. You're going to have some cotton in small numbers. Cotton doesn't really kick off until you get to the development of the cotton gin. Some indigo. You're going to have some rice, some things like that. Once the Stuarts get back on the throne after Cromwell, there's going to be a lot of what we call proprietary colonies, that quid pro quo. These are friends that had supported the Stuarts during these difficult years. And so they try to pay these people back by giving them territory in the New World. And so that influences the expansion of the colonies. The next thing you need to be aware of is going to be the Caribbean. Now, we don't dwell if we were a, say, graduate level class, we would go into a great deal of detail on the Caribbean, because at the college, for a history major, the Caribbean is included in the colonial system. But I think for a 1301 class, it's not really necessary. But I will say this much. The Caribbean was still a big player. Just because Spain had dominated in that region did not mean that England and France were not trying to grab their piece of the Caribbean pie. The Caribbean was very well known for making sugar. In fact, many of the islands in the Caribbean, that's all they did was make sugar. To the extent that these islands often did not produce enough of their own food supply. And so this is where, again, I've mentioned this before, coffee, tea, those things that get introduced from Asia and from the Middle East, Europeans want it to be sweetened, and so they turn to sugar processing. England and Spain will be the two biggest players, although France does have some islands there as well. And there's lots of kind of shifting of hands. This is the golden age of piracy. Think, the Pirates of the Caribbean, that kind of thing. Really kind of begins in like 1500s, continues into the 1600s, even up into the early 1700s. And a lot of this is over, you've got different islands that transition control from different European powers, a few islands that are consistently under the control of one or the other. You're going to have lots of pirates that are raiding ships, many of them with permission from their home country. And so the Caribbean is importing tons of slaves to process sugar. And the Dutch are right there to kind of, help provide the slaves. And so because they burn through the native population super quickly, they turn to African slavery. And this leads to what will be kind of the classic American slave system, especially for the states in the deep south of the colonies in the deep south, where you're looking at a large number of African slaves with a very small number of white owners and merchants. And so you're going to end up having the development of laws and rules to control the slave population. That's a direct result of this kind of population imbalance. And so some of these punishments are really quite horrific. They are truly meant to terrorize and break the spirit and the will of the African slaves that are working in the Caribbean. Sugar processing is a dangerous, difficult thing. And so this is kind of part of the story. So the southern colonies will import the Caribbean slave system as they start to require more and more slaves. And I think it's very important to understand kind of how that slave code begins to be created because of the fear of revolts, the fear that they couldn't control their slave population. And there's a limited amount of land. So there's a limited opportunity, but the promise that you can really make a lot of money in sugar, and indeed there's a number of characters in world history that have made their fortune from sugar plantations in the Caribbean, are going to really attract people. And then you're going to see that Englishmen who look at the Caribbean islands and say, well, there's not room for me here. Where else can I go? They're going to be attracted to places like South Carolina. And so this is where that expansion is going to come from. So Carolina, I put on here who wants to live there. Basically, you have 8 friends of Charles II, which is why it's called Carolina, have a joint proprietorship. So they all have, they're all this individual, a group of 8 guys own this property, right? Eventually it becomes a royal colony in 1729, and so they only have it for a little while. But, you're probably talking about 60 years or so. It was initially one colony, but as the territory right here is very different. And so South Carolina lends itself to a much more kind of Caribbean environment, whereas North Carolina is a lot more like Virginia. And so it's much more tobacco friendly and that kind of thing, whereas South Carolina was more for sugar. So they were initially one colony, but by 1680 you really have kind of a development that's different. And by 1701, they were officially two separate colonies. And this is because of just the nature of what they produce. They have a little bit of a hierarchical society, especially in South Carolina, whereas in North Carolina, they want a system that's much more like the Virginia House of Burgesses. And so the South Carolina will attract these Caribbean transplants and their slave systems, and North Carolina will be affected by the overflow of the Virginia population, and by people who are attracted to this concept of the small individual farmer. So you will have some plantations in North Carolina. It's not that you don't have any. It's not that you don't have slavery in North Carolina, because you do, but it just functions slightly differently, with South Carolina being much more reminiscent of the Caribbean, with the emphasis on sugar, on extreme wealth, and extreme poverty, and pretty much all of South Carolina is going to be dominated by that type of plantation system, whereas North Carolina is going to have some plantations, but they're going to rely heavily on tobacco as well as other grains, and North Carolina as well is going to have, especially when you get out here to the frontier area, that's going to be more small farms and families that either don't own slaves or only own a couple. One thing about this area of, say, Virginia, North Carolina, and Maryland is these areas, especially like Maryland, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, they will end up being the breadbasket for South Carolina and the Caribbean, because those territories will be so dominated by cash crops with sugar that they won't necessarily be able to produce enough foodstuffs for the population of slaves that they have. Products do vary from North to South Carolina, so that's kind of important to know. The impact of Carolina, I've mentioned this already, the Caribbean slave codes being brought to North America. And by the time you get to 1680, you really have the full transition of African servants turning into African slaves. And I mentioned this when we talked about 1619. That initially Africans were brought over, and their condition of servitude was not anything like what we think of when we think of slavery. I'm not suggesting that they were treated identical to English indentured servants, but it was not this permanent state. There typically was a way out. Many of them would have to serve longer terms, so they would serve, 15 years instead of 7. And of course, living 15 years in Virginia was not an easy task. But you did have a way you could work your way out of it. And there's a handful of accounts of Africans that did manage to do so. And so they begin to bring those codes into North America. And so slavery becomes a permanent institution. It becomes a permanent state. Slave status is inherited from the mother. So now, when white men rape black women, the children that are the product of that are forced into slavery. And there's no way that a black woman can, through marriage or through having a child, gain access to freedom. And I think it's very important for us to recognize that this is a development that happens after. And I don't know, to me, and maybe I'm being idealistic, to me this is part of what makes American slavery so truly awful, is that it had the chance to not develop this way. Had they decided to run their systems differently, they could have decided that, but they don't. They choose to legislate by law that human beings can own other human beings. And to me, this is one of kind of the uglier aspects of American slavery that often gets pushed aside in the whole conversation. So I just want to be sure and point that out to you. Southern planter culture dominates South Carolina. The cash crop mentality that I talked about. South Carolina had a very difficult seasoning period. It takes it a while for it to really get off the ground. You have lots of conflict in South Carolina with Spanish Florida, lots of conflict with southeastern tribes, so this kind of affects South Carolina and even North Carolina to a lesser extent. So just kind of understand that the Spanish still find a way to kind of annoy the English, especially in those southern areas. Now, we're going to move back up to the north, and I told you back when we looked at the conquest documents that we weren't going to look at the Dutch very much. And the Dutch, of course, had bought the island of Manhattan, and they had begun to trade there. And it's because of the Anglo-Dutch Wars that the Dutch West India Company loses interest in maintaining its foothold in North America. Navigation acts play a role to play with this. One of the developments, one of the reasons they have navigation acts is because the Dutch were so heavily involved in trade, and the English wanted to keep the Dutch from benefiting from North American trade. And so the Dutch had come in, they had created New Amsterdam, which is what becomes New York, Fort Orange, all that kind of stuff. Dutch West India Company was the joint stock company meant to develop this region. So by 1664, the English take over what is now New York, and dominate the region. And there's all kinds of, like I said, I just spent a week in New York this summer, learning about some of this stuff. So there's a whole part of New York State history that goes back through this that isn't really relevant to a survey class, right? Or unless we were really focusing on New York. And so just kind of understand that this is how the Dutch kind of get pushed out. This is why I say they're just kind of a blip, right? Because you're talking about really, less than 50 years of them having any kind of influence. But here's the part that makes it interesting, is that the Dutch, you still have Dutch settlers that, adapt to English control. New Yorkers are very independent, very different, very diverse population. They have a lot of different nationalities, whether it's Dutch, whether it's English, whether it's French. They've got some Germans. They've got an early Jewish population. They have slaves. Slaves are not there to develop cash crops like they are in South Carolina, but owning house slaves was a big deal in New York. So you've got lots of merchants, lots of trading. New York is a very wealthy state. And it's very diverse, and a lot of different ideas and a lot of different backgrounds, ethnicities, that kind of thing, a lot of different religions. And so it's a tricky state to govern. And it will continue to be so for really kind of a long time. One could argue that New York can still be a tricky state to govern, even in the 21st century. So just kind of know that that's how New York develops, that it's kind of got its unique personality there. And the Duke of York will own much of the land, but he will begin to sell it off in pieces. So some of the other colonies that will come from here, say like New Jersey, will come because the Duke of York sells off part of his land. So that's how New York comes to be. New Jersey, he will, it will, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. It wasn't New Jersey that was owned by the Duke of York. But he sells some of his other land to like Connecticut and that kind of thing. New Jersey is owned by the guys who have Carolinas. They sell their land to the Quakers. The Quakers are unwelcomed by the Puritans. Quakers are perceived as being kind of strange, and they take Protestantism in a whole new level. And I'll talk some more about them when we talk about Pennsylvania. So they sell part of it to that, but they don't, it's not dominated by Quakers by any stretch of the imagination. And it's kind of just another colony. It very quickly becomes a royal colony by 1702. Now we get to Pennsylvania. All right, so the Quakers are in, they're kind of an offshoot of the Puritan branch, right? If the Separatists were kind of a sect, the Quakers are going to be kind of a sect. Except the difference with the Quakers is that they perceive that one's relationship with God is that you have an inner light and you have an inner experience. And when you experience God and you have a relationship with Him, it can cause you to shake and dance. And that what you need to focus on essentially is connecting with God on the inside, and that reading the Bible is secondary to having that inner relationship, right? And they so believe in the supremacy of the individual in their relationship with God, that you don't have ministers, that it's everybody, that when you have a Quaker church, everyone is equal, right? They make no distinctions between men and women. Women can be just as valid as people who experience God as men. So God doesn't distinguish between that. And this begins to create some problems with the Puritans. They don't like this message. They feel like this is a little too radical. And so the Quakers really persecute them, but they also get persecuted in England as well. Remember, you had the whole, Commonwealth under Cromwell. Obviously, Cromwell's not going to tolerate any differences, which is part of the irony of kind of like, oh, well, the Pilgrims were so persecuted. Well, it's not very long before they persecute the Quakers. And when they persecute the Quakers, they, run them out of town and send them off, to go fend for themselves in the frontier. Or they kill them, or they put them in jail. I mean, they do significant... the Quakers were persecuted against, by my definition of persecution. And so I think that's kind of interesting. William Penn actually had started off as kind of a wealthy individual. He inherits some of his money. He becomes a Quaker. Gets Pennsylvania as kind of a haven for them. And then he will end up losing his money and dying in kind of a debtor's prison. And this kind of shows you see there was East New Jersey, West New Jersey, because again, the Quakers, nobody wanted to be near them. So they have to have their own section of New Jersey, not just, they can't just live with everyone else. And so then you're going to see Pennsylvania's right over here. So this is meant to be a haven. The king gives the charter pretty easily because, who likes the Quakers? They're weird. And so Pennsylvania initially becomes part of a little corner of Delaware, but then it expands and becomes its own thing. They develop the city of Philadelphia. It's if you're into urban development and that kind of thing, the development of Philadelphia is pretty telling because of the way they design it in kind of this grid pattern and all that kind of stuff. It becomes very much a model city. Pennsylvania, because they're Quakers, right, they treat Native Americans equally. So they buy the land from the Indians. They have a trial by jury. They have an extensive right to vote. Lots of these very progressive ideas. They believe in pacifism. And so just kind of know that Pennsylvania has a different start than a lot of the others. It's kind of along the same vein as, say, Maryland, in the sense that it was meant as a haven for a certain minority group to escape to. But it doesn't take very long before other people are just coming into Pennsylvania regardless. There is a significant Quaker population there, but they just don't maintain being the majority. Georgia becomes what they call a penal colony. It is, first off, it's meant to be a buffer zone with the Spanish because Georgia's right there next to South Carolina. And so it's meant to keep Spanish Florida from harassing the sugar plantations too terribly much. And so their idea is to send political dissenters and people in debtor's prison over there. And so they have this penal colony set up. And the people would get, once they served their term, they would get 50 acres and a year's worth of supplies. And they tried to limit ownership. They didn't want it to become a slave colony or anything like that. They wanted these to be small individual farms. But what ends up happening is that the trustees will start to, first off, there's not enough people in debtor's prison willing to go because they know that they're going to face Indians and the Spanish and all that kind of stuff. So then they start to appeal to settlers and families, and those people start coming over here, and they want to own more than 50 acres. And so gradually what's going to happen is you're going to have large plantations, and they're going to turn into an environment. All right, sorry, I got interrupted. Very similar to South Carolina, which means they're going to develop slavery and that kind of thing. So just know that Georgia is unique in the sense that its intention was to be a penal colony. Never quite takes off. Now, what's funny is that, nice quotations around that, is that England does not abandon this idea of penal colonies, right? So Georgia doesn't work out like they want, but then they discover Australia, and they decide to make Australia a giant penal colony. So this notion of clearing out the debtors' prisons by sending them overseas is something that the English are very much attracted to, although it becomes less and less significant for the North American colonies, especially by the time you get to the early 1700s, because the experiment with Georgia doesn't quite work the way they plan. So that kind of gives you a sense for how Georgia develops. Native Americans, and I've mentioned this before, I don't want you to think that they just laid down and said, oh, there's nothing we can do. What were helpless. Just know that they do try at various times to push back and to somehow get, get a handle on English settlement. But it's never enough, ever, ever, ever. And a lot of this is because early on they were focused instead on these kind of political struggles with themselves. And so early on, they didn't have a unified front. Well, by the time they figure out we've got to put aside some of our differences, it's too late. And even then, you don't have one single consolidated effort. You're going to have, Metacom in New England. You're going to have, other Indians down around South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, that area. But those groups won't act together, and so they just are never very effective. So just know that we kind of have these attempts in the 1600s for the Native Americans to push back, but they're not super successful. And the end result of this is just further death and further loss of life for the Native Americans. You do begin to see in the late 1600s a handful of Protestants that begin to say we really need to try to convert these Indians, and some of them do attempt. John Eliot is one of them. And one of the big problems that we see, though, is that even the Indians that do convert, that do become educated, that dress English and all this kind of stuff, they're typically not accepted by the English population. And so it's really quite unfortunate to see. If you contrast that with the French, who very clearly welcomed, once the Huron converted to Catholicism, they were in the same group. They were, they defended them and treated them with a degree of respect. The Spanish, for all that they were such awful conquistadors in the beginning, by the time you get to the 1700s, the encomienda system has dictated that the native population, while they often remain very poor, that they are treated with some degree of respect. And you begin to have kind of a change in that system. So really, it's the English that are never open to any kind of any other ethnicity in the same degree that the French and the Spanish are, which I think is something that we might not have picked up on if you're talking about the conquest documents. All right, so I'm just going to touch on a little bit of Bacon and Berkeley because we're going to be looking at these documents in class this week. This is why you're having to endure this lecture over the weekend. I want you to think about, these are some things I want you to consider. Okay, first off, 1676 to 77. This has to do with Virginia. Why does it matter? It's going to matter because of slavery. It's going to matter because of this idea of a frontier concept and the frustration of opportunity. And we're going to see kind of this issue over kind of a political struggle among the English, among the wealthy and the elite who have control, and the ordinary people who do not. And some could argue that we, basically still have the same conflict today, that our political system is still a conflict of the elites who dominate the political system with their money, and the rest of us who are just trying to survive. And so I think we'll find the Bacon and Berkeley campaign is pretty interesting. And so we'll go into some more about that. And so we'll see. Slavery is going to expand as we move into the later 1600s and into the early 1700s. It's really going to be a very significant development in the southern part of the colonies. It never takes off in New England. First off, you've got the Quakers who don't believe in slavery. They're going to be some of the earliest abolitionists. And then you're going to have Puritans who are focused on family contact and that kind of thing. And it's not that they never owned slaves. They just typically had no need to. They were family units. They often had multiple kids. And they didn't grow crops the same way they do in the South. You're talking about smaller subsistence level farming that's strictly for the family. And so they just don't need slaves to the same extent. New York will have slavery primarily as house slaves or as people to work in the in the kind of the merchant sector, loading stuff and unloading stuff, that kind of thing. Boston, you'll have the occasional slave working in shipping. Many of those, though, typically are going to be those that manage to escape slavery, either truly by escaping or because they were part of that earlier system and they were able to somehow commute their slavery into freedom. So just know that slavery begins to replace indentured servitude. We have the slave codes emerging at the beginning of the 1700s and kind of the real kind of development of American racism. Following this period, you're going to have a number of conflicts that are related to Europe. And because we're not world history and because we're not an upper division history class, I'm not going to go in a whole bunch of detail. I think the end results that you need to know of all these, and these all have weird names like the War of Jenkins' Ear and stuff like that. And a lot of these actually have to do with the Caribbean and this conflict over the various Caribbean islands. But the gist is you've got increasing tension with the French and the English. You've got tension with some Indians, and then with other Indian groups, you have emerging relationships. Because in the colonies, they would often turn to different Indian groups to fight alongside them. And at the end of the day, all of this is going to result, in a stronger military presence in the colonies, whether they're French colonies or American colonies. So France, for all that it had kind of minimal interest in sending a bunch of people over there, when you start looking at the imperial wars that come from the Caribbean region that bleed over into royal politics in Europe, the French will start to send more soldiers because they have to protect their territory and they want to find a way to harass the English. So just kind of grasp that we do have this tension in the late 1600s, early 1700s. This too could be another reason why the Navigation Acts are not as enforced at the beginning of the 18th century, because European powers were much more concerned with solidifying their control and that kind of thing. So what we begin to see is kind of an attempt based off of politics in England to kind of consolidate power. I mentioned here that the Navigation Acts really kind of really start under Cromwell, really began to take up with the Stuarts coming back in. I believe it's Charles II tries to have a Dominion of New England, which was meant to centralize authority. But the colonists didn't like the Dominion of New England. They didn't like one single power in England telling them what to do. Again, why England couldn't figure out that this meant the colonies were out of control, I don't know. But, so yeah, the Dominion of New England quickly fails. And some of this is helped by the fact that, the Glorious Revolution basically kicks out kind of the male part of the Stuart line. Mary is a Stuart. But now she's married to William of Orange, and so they're kind of like co-regents. And so when they come in 1688, they begin to create a very distinct system that is like a bureaucracy, right? So in other words, the king and the queen do kind of run things, but there's multiple layers before it even gets to them. Things like the Vice Admiralty Courts, the Board of Trade. And so they start to have some increasing royal control. But they keep getting distracted by these imperial conflicts, and so it's a work in progress. They begin the process. One could almost look at the way the Navigation Acts and English control develops in the 1750s and 1760s as really being kind of the natural result of what begins in 1688. That they start trying to figure out how to run this place. And it takes them a few decades to figure it out. So just know that this whole system is already put in place. So the things that the Founding Fathers will start to be angry about aren't necessarily new developments. And so there's some attempts at increasing royal control. Colonial representatives that are in the colonies from England become extremely important. The colonies become extremely important to the English economy in the early 1700s. And so at the end of the day, we can ask the question if British control was really all that horrible. And so this is just kind of a synopsis of English politics, because in order to understand how these colonies kind of come into being, how they get developed, and some of the dysfunction that gets laid down, you have to understand this political system and how they work and how they don't work. So we've covered basically with these two lectures the establishment of the major colonies, the establishment of the major trends. I've touched on a lot of different things that have to do with religion, that have to do with politics, that have to do with economics. And again, this is just kind of the overview. I'm just barely skimming the surface. There's a number of places that we could have gone way deeper if we had the time. What I'm trying to do is focus on the things that help you understand the creation of the United States as we know it. So I don't need to go into a bunch of detail, I don't think, on colonial life. We will, with the next lecture, kind of look at life in the 18th century. I may even kind of have you do kind of some individual research on that. So we'll see how that goes. But just know that that we're I've kind of given you this smush bubble of information, and you need to be coming away with the notion that the colonies, that you have this idea of mercantilism, of raw materials, of trade, that you have early attempts at English control, that the idea is that England is going to control the economy of the colonies is not a new thing, and that the notion that somehow this came out of nowhere in the 1700s is completely false. And you also need to know that the colonies are very different, that they have different attitudes, they have different ways of coming into being, whether it's Georgia, whether it's Pennsylvania, whether it's New Jersey, and that they somehow don't, always get along with each other. They have different interests. They have different economies. They have different goals in mind. At this juncture in the 1700s, they're trying to make the most money they possibly can. Many of them are only really concerned with that, and only really concerned with, their legal and their smuggling trade operations. And this becomes a place of opportunity for many people. For the people that the Stuarts are paying back, it's opportunity for them. For middle-class families, it's opportunity for them. And in most of these colonies, they are seeing an opportunity not only to make it financially, but they're also seeing an opportunity to have a say in the nature of government in a way that they didn't have a say in England. And all of this results in, and I used this analogy last week, the idea that you have that 2-year-old that you never discipline, you never get on to them. Well, now that 2-year-old is starting to grow up into a preteen, and there's lots of eye rolling and, oh, you can't be serious going on here between the American colonies and Mother England. And so there's beginning to have this very kind of tense relationship, and the foundation of this is largely what we would call the benign neglect of English politics, because they're way too busy with other things and just, focusing on the dollar figures and the influence from the American colonies. All right, so I think that's enough. We will look at Bacon and Berkeley in class this week and kind of delve into what that means. And so I think that's pretty much it. And thank you for listening.